Hello, my name's Nick Manning and I manage the front office at Redfern Legal Centre. We've been getting a lot of questions lately from tenants about rent reductions and negotiating with your landlord during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I've asked one of our tenancy advisors to come along and answer some of the main questions that people have. So welcome, Alison. Would you like to turn on your mic and introduce yourself and your role here at Redfern Legal Centre?
Hi, Nick. Hi, everyone. I'm Alison. I'm a solicitor here at Redfern Legal Centre working in the tenancy team.
Thanks. So before we get into the questions, I should let everyone know that we've put together a set of useful written resources online. We've collected a set of links on our website. That address has been on your screen and I'll show that address again at the end of the video. So all the references that Alison makes, you'll be able to find those in one handy place on our website. I should also stress that this video is general information and it's not legal advice. Near the end of the video, I'll let you know where you can get legal advice as a tenant in New South Wales. Okay, Alison, let's get started. For those who haven't watched our other video, can you give us a quick summary of what's happened with rent reductions and evictions in New South Wales during the pandemic?
Sure. So on the 15th of April this year, the New South Wales government enacted some new regulations to provide some protection to tenants who have been impacted as a result of COVID-19. So essentially what the new regulations incorporate are a 6-month moratorium on evictions for rent arrears, which will end on the 15th of October. So as part of that moratorium, there's an initial 60-day stop, which essentially prevents landlords from issuing any notices of termination or making applications to the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal on the basis that a tenant has failed to pay their rent. And then after this initial 60-day period, a landlord is able to initiate termination action for rent arrears, but only if the tenant is at least 14 days behind in rent, and if the landlord can demonstrate that they have engaged in good faith negotiations with the tenant through fair trading's formal dispute resolution process, and also that it's fair and reasonable in the circumstances to terminate the tenancy. So tenants who are protected by these new regulations are tenants whose renting household, so that is anyone that lives in the household that contributes to the rent. So where a renting household has had a reduction in its income of at least 25%, then tenants are covered by the new regulations. It's also worth noting that just this week, the government has also passed some new amendments to the Residential Tenancies Act, which allows tenants impacted by COVID-19 to apply for early termination of their fixed term tenancies in certain circumstances, with a reduction in the maximum amount of compensation which can be paid to the landlord. And the New South Wales Tenants Union and the New South Wales Department of Fair Trading have really great fact sheets on their websites, which provide a lot more detail about the new regulations and the amendments to the Act. So I'd really recommend that all tenants that are having issues with rent reduction, seeking rent reductions or negotiating should have a look at those resources.
Okay, thanks. So under these new regulations, what obligation does my landlord have to negotiate with me?
Yeah, so your landlord has an obligation to negotiate with you in good faith when they are, or before rather, they try and terminate you for rent arrears. So the negotiations with your landlord can take place informally, but where informal negotiations have failed, prior to making an application in the tribunal or prior to issuing you with a notice of termination for failure to pay your rent, the landlord must have also engaged in good faith negotiations with you through the Department of Fair Trading's formal rent negotiation process. It's really important to note, though, that there is currently no legal obligation or requirement that the landlord agree to reduce your rent. The only obligation that they have is to negotiate with you in good faith prior to taking any termination action against you for rent arrears.
Okay, that's interesting. As a tenant then, when should I start negotiations?
Yeah, look, we'd say as soon as possible. It's really important that you notify your landlord as soon as you can about any change in your financial circumstances due to COVID-19. And when you notify them of the change to your income, we'd also recommend that you put forward or propose an amount of rent that you are going to be able to afford to pay on an ongoing basis. And it's also important to do it as soon as you can, because you might want to know at the earliest possible time whether or not any negotiation, whether you're going to be able to reach an agreement that's reasonable, because if not, you might need to look into other alternative options, such as breaking your lease and finding alternative accommodation, which is cheaper.
Okay, so how do I negotiate? Like, should I email, should I phone, send a text, set up a face-to-face meeting? And do I negotiate with the real estate agent, or should I try to bypass them and go straight to the landlord?
Yeah, so it's always best to make sure that any negotiations or agreements that are reached about a rent reduction are in writing. So it's fine to have an initial conversation with your real estate agent or your landlord over the phone or face-to-face, for example, but we would always advise tenants and recommend that they follow up with an email or a letter, which basically just confirms what the agreement is or what the main points of negotiation were. That's basically just so if there's any dispute in the future about what amount of rent you actually owe, there's a bit of a paper trail which can be used as evidence to demonstrate what was included in the agreement and what wasn't. And in terms of negotiating with the landlord or your real estate agent, if you do have direct regular contact with your landlord, it might be more efficient to negotiate directly with them. And under the Residential Tenancies Act, the landlord is required to provide you with their contact details. However, many landlords do prefer that contact goes through real estate agents, and a lot of tenants only really have contact with real estate agents on a day-to-day basis. That's okay too, because a real estate agent is acting on the instructions of a landlord. So any offer of or proposed rent reduction that you put to them, or any negotiations you have with a real estate agent, they will also have to pass on to the landlord to seek instructions about whether the landlord is willing to accept that or whether the landlord has another offer to make. So in any case, any of the negotiations should be being fed back to the landlord by the real estate agent. I'll also just note here that the Department of Fair Trading website has some template letters and like examples of letters that tenants can send to their landlords requesting a rent reduction. And these could also be adapted into emails if that's the preferred way, rather than sending a letter. So I'd recommend that tenants have a look at those documents because that will give some guidance as well.
Yes, I've also noticed here at Redfern Legal Centre that some tenants are being asked to fill in forms from their real estate agent that have a bit of a template look to them. So I think possibly some of the larger real estate agents have got their own sort of paperwork system going. But that brings the question of personal financial documents. Like, what financial documents should I have to provide as a tenant? And should the landlord have to provide the same financial information, financial documents? And a lot of people don't want to reveal these sorts of personal details. What do you say to that?
Look, I think when tenants are making a request for a rent reduction, they should expect to be required to provide at least some documents evidencing their financial situation. So the main thing that you're going to need to demonstrate is how much your income was prior to COVID-19 and what it is currently as a result of COVID-19. So the sorts of information that you could provide to your landlord are things like letters from your employers that that show that you've either been stood down or you had a reduction in your hours, and might sort of state what your income was previously compared to what it is now, as well as any documentation that you have in relation to any JobKeeper or job seeker payments or other Centrelink entitlements. We would say that that's sort of the basic financial information that you should provide. And if the landlord demands further financial information, such as bank accounts and that kind of thing, to evidence your financial situation, well, there's an argument there that they should then also provide you with evidence of their financial situation, particularly in a circumstance where they are saying that they cannot agree to a proposed rent reduction because they can't afford it. Part of a good faith negotiation would involve them being, open and transparent with you about their financial situation as well. So if they're requiring you to provide, bank account details, bank account statements and everything like that, then there is an argument that they should also do that.
Okay, that makes sense. So what if a landlord is refusing to negotiate or doesn't even respond to a request to negotiate, or if the two sides can't reach an agreement they're both happy with? Is there a formal dispute resolution process that can be used?
Yeah, we have this query a lot because we have a lot of tenants who come to us for advice whose landlords are just refusing to negotiate, or as you say, Nick, there's been no agreement reached that both parties will agree to. Yes, there is the New South Wales Department of Fair Trading has established a formal rent negotiation process, which is actually just going through their formal complaints process and formal dispute resolution process, which can be utilised by landlords and tenants to assist in negotiations. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, the formal dispute resolution process set up by Fair Trading must be utilised and engaged in good faith negotiations between the parties prior to a landlord being able to issue a notice of termination or make an application for termination on the basis of rent arrears. It should be noted that Fair Trading doesn't have the ability to reach an agreement for the parties and doesn't have the agreement to actually set a particular rent reduction, but rather to oversee the negotiation process, request that the parties provide certain documents to facilitate a good faith negotiation. And I'll also just mention here, in terms of what a good faith negotiation encompasses, it's hard to define in many cases, and it does depend on the circumstances of each case. But generally, it involves both parties dealing with each other honestly and fairly and working together towards a mutually beneficial arrangement. And it often involves compromise, so both parties being required to compromise on certain aspects in order to reach an agreement. So the formal dispute resolution process can be accessed via the New South Wales Department of Fair Trading website, which will be included in the links on our website, which you can access at the end of this video. Okay,
so as a tenant, can I initiate the formal rent negotiation process, or does the landlord have to?
No, the tenant is able to as well, and we would advise tenants to do so as soon as it becomes clear that the informal negotiations with your landlord are getting you nowhere. And as I said, there is a link on the Fair Trading website which will allow you to do this.
Okay, the next question is really a question of tactics. Should, as a tenant, should I go all out and ask for a reduction in my rent, or would a rent deferral make me appear more reasonable? Like, have you got any suggestions about tactics?
Yeah, it's a hard one. There's currently no legal obligation for the landlord to agree to reduce your rent rather than simply defer it. However, we would argue that in many circumstances, a simple deferral of rent can't be considered to be reasonable because it will simply exacerbate a tenant's financial distress further down the track if they're having to pay back a large rental debt to the landlord. So, we would recommend that, particularly if you have suffered a reduction in your income, a reduction in your wages rather than a deferral in your wages, then yes, you should definitely be requesting a rent reduction from your landlord. Now, some tactics that you could use to try and see if the landlord will agree to reduce your rent is to draw on the length and the history of the tenancy, for example. So if you've been in the property for a significant period of time, and if you've been a good tenant in the past, you've got a record of always paying your rent on time, generally looking after the property, and having no sort of prior issues with your tenancy, then it's actually in the landlord's best interests in many cases to try and keep you in the property as a good tenant, even if that means reducing the rent for you for a short period of time. Because the alternative, if they refuse to reduce rent, it may result in tenants needing to leave the property and terminating their tenancies. And that could actually mean that the landlord is trying to find a new tenant in quite a difficult rental climate at the moment, and also might end up meaning that they have to rent their property at a lower rental rate anyway, because we have seen that as a result of COVID, there has been a decline in market rents of the property. So drawing on things like your history as a tenant, and also making it clear to the landlord that in these circumstances, it is in their best interest to keep you in the property for as long as they can, at least paying some, reduced rent. That might be a really helpful way to get a rent reduction agreed to.
Okay, that makes sense. I have to say the new regulations sound complicated. When do you suggest that a tenant gets legal advice on their situation?
Yeah, okay, so at the moment we recommend that tenants should get legal advice if they're in a position where they've been issued a termination notice, if their landlord is refusing to negotiate or negotiations have sort of reached a stalemate, or if a formal rent negotiation process has been gone through but there's still no agreement that's been reached that is affordable for the tenant and they're looking to break their lease, for example, early. In those circumstances, absolutely, tenants should be seeking legal advice. We do also advise tenants to first try and engage with all of the online resources, because there are quite a few that provide really great information about how to negotiate rent reductions and the process and what the regulations are, because many tenancy advice services around New South Wales are currently under an unprecedented demand for advice. So it might actually take services a while to respond to a tenant's query. So that's sort of why we recommend that tenants try and utilise all of the online resources and go through the negotiation process with their landlords as much as possible first, prior to seeking legal advice.
Okay, thanks. So the final question for me is where a tenant can get legal advice. So there's a network of tenants' advice and advocacy services across New South Wales, covering all parts of the state. If you go to the address I'm about to tell you, which is also repeated on our website, which is www.tenants.org.au, and on the homepage there you put in your suburb or town and it will give you the contact details of your local tenants advice service, and there's also an Aboriginal specific tenants advice service for each suburb and town. Just to clarify, that address isn't our web address, that's the address where you can find your local tenants advice service. At the end of this video, our web address will appear where all the resources that Alison has referred to will be available, linked on our site. Look, thank you, Alison, that was great. If you'd like to say goodbye and mute your mic.
Sure. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everyone. I hope that information was useful, and good luck to everyone in negotiating with your landlords.
Thanks, Alison. So Redfern Legal Centre's other video explains the new regulations in more detail that Alison has referred to, covering rent reductions and evictions during the COVID-19 period. That video is available through the same channels as this video. Now I'll say goodbye, and you'll be able to see that web address behind me on the screen where you can find all the resources that we've referred to. Thank you.